This is the first video in the Anyone Can Win Entrepreneurial Training Program, and we're going to start with something that's really critical. Over the next few videos, step by step, we're going to build the skill of resourcing. If you're a self-employed entrepreneur just starting out, whether you're in the middle of your business or anytime you move on to a new venture or try to expand beyond where you are, this is something that you just need to master. The skill of resourcing is simply starting with the little bit you might have and then learning how to leverage that to end up with even more so that you can move ahead. And it's quite an art, and it's a lot of fun to do once you get the knack of it. So we're going to start that here in just a few seconds. Okay, if you know anything about me, you've heard it said on this website and in other places on the internet that I was the first blind child in the United States that was allowed to have a public school education. I went all the way from kindergarten right through high school, never missed a grade, never was kept back. And not that I was a great, rocket science student and all, but I was in the upper third of every class I was in, and that was good enough to get me through and get me my diplomas. And then I went on to the University of Connecticut, where I majored in theoretic physics and mathematics. I double majored. Along the way, some interesting things happened. And part of my ability to resource, which I found to be a very important skill, which I needed to do very early in life, even as a child, really helped me later on and laid the foundation for my success. So I'm going to start by sharing the story of how I became the first blind child in the public school system, allowed to have a public school education in the United States. Very simply, I had an eye test in kindergarten. That was the first real eye test that I had had. And up until then, they just thought I was some klutzy little kid who, if you threw something to him, he missed it, and, bumping into walls and tripping over things all the time. They just figured I was a clumsy little kid. And matter of fact, there was even some discussion that I might be mentally retarded because people would give instructions to me, mainly by using their hands, and I didn't understand that. They didn't understand I couldn't see what they were doing, and they just figured I couldn't comprehend their hand gestures. So it was a real interesting experience growing up that way. But in kindergarten, I had that eye test, and they discovered that I was legally blind, and someday I would be totally blind. And so the principal thought that was important enough to take me home to meet my mother and explain to her what was going on and why I could not continue in public school and why I had to be sent away to one of the blind institutions to be educated in the state of Connecticut, which was my home state. My mother happened to be home that day, and when the principal brought me to the door, my poor mother, you can imagine hearing all this news all at one time. See, my mother was an immigrant to the United States, and she came here speaking 6 languages, and English wasn't her best language. That was her 7th language that she was learning so she could become a citizen. Probably the story will make a lot more sense if I explain a little bit about my mother. My mother went through World War II over in Europe. She was actually in the underground during World War II. My mother took a stand for 5 or 6 years against the fascist governments who would knock on your door in the middle of the night and confiscate your child and put him into some fascist youth group for indoctrinating at 8 or 10 years old. So you can just understand my poor mother trying to understand what this person was telling her in English, that her son, for some reason that made no sense to my mother, was going to be confiscated, put into a state school. And this is a representative of the state, the principal, telling her this. Now, in Europe during World War II, the word state was not a warm, friendly, fuzzy word. Do any reading in any of the literature out of Europe, and you would see what the word state meant to them. And it was not a friendly thing. So my mother kind of freaked out, and she was prepared to go to jail rather than let them take me out of the home and put me into a state-run institution where I might come home on holidays. And back in those days, we didn't have the interstate highway system, so the 75 miles away that I would have been, a 4-hour trip to get there and a 4-hour trip to get back home. But, that's just the way it was. Fortunately, we had a congressman who was elected at that time who spoke one of my mother's languages, and he was trying to explain to her that this was not a bad thing in the United States, but he convinced her that she should at least take a look at the blind school and see what it was all about. She went up to the blind school and she saw it was a very friendly place. There were not a lot of stairs, mostly ramps. Buildings were connected with a piece of rope from door to door that you could follow. Things were marked in Braille. Anything important made an audible sound. They even had a baseball with a bell in it so that they could do something that they called playing baseball, because it would jingle and then you try to swing a bat and hit it as the ball jingled past you. And she thought that was interesting. The hallways were fairly free of obstruction. There were no fire extinguishers hanging on the wall that you would walk into if you were guiding by the wall. And she thought, and they were laying the trip on her that she was being selfish by wanting to keep me home rather than send me to this school that was so prepared for blind kids. They almost had my mother convinced that that's what should happen. And as she was walking away, she turned around and she said, well, this is the grammar school. What does the high school look like? And they said, well, we don't have one right now, but your son is young enough. By the time he gets out of 8th grade, for sure we're going to have a high school. And she thought a second more and she said, and then what? Will you have a blind college? Will he get out and get a blind job? Will he marry a blind woman? Will he have blind children? At what point will my son meet the real world that he's going to have to live in as an adult? And that's when she went home and fought even harder to help me stay at home with her. She also felt God gave me to her the way I was, and that I was her responsibility. I wasn't the state's responsibility to raise and to take care of. And so in September of that year, a wonderful first grade teacher who was relatively new said, I'll step up and I'll take the challenge. And she said, I don't know how I'll teach him, but I'm willing to try. And that's how I started in public school. And she was a great lady. Her name was Rosemary Wagner. She's gone now. She taught me the alphabet, and she taught me how to form those letters into words. Obviously, I couldn't read, and I couldn't write, but it was good enough to get through and move on to the 2nd grade and to continue to move through. By the way, they didn't teach Braille in public schools, so basically I made it all the way to high school, not being able to read, not being able to write, and basically and no Braille, so basically I was a functional illiterate. But that's another story, and we'll cover that here and how we worked around that. The reason I'm sharing that with you, because it kicked in my need to start resourcing at a very young age. And the first lesson came shortly after all that experience with my mother, because on her deathbed, the last week of her life, she shared some thoughts with me about that day when the principal came to the door. And after being in the underground for 6 years, she thought, my God, basically she wasn't going to let the state take me no matter what it took, because she said, quite frankly, I'll be damned if I risk my life for 6 years fighting the governments that thought they could confiscate your child, and I come to the freest country in the world and they take mine. With a mom like that, how could I lose? She's gone now, but the first lesson she taught me was a few days after kindergarten ended and we won that victory for me to go on to 1st grade, and I was walking out the door to go play, and she said to me, hey, you go out there and you do anything you want to do, and don't let anybody tell you you can't do anything. You're the only one who can determine that, and don't let them stop you. The only reason you shouldn't do something is because you came up with a reason why you couldn't do it. And as I turned around to start walking back out the door, she stopped me again. And she said to me at 5.5 years old, she said, just be sure of one thing. You know the difference between a reason and an excuse. That's a pretty heavy thing to lay on a 5.5-year-old kid, but it set the pattern in motion for my life and all the success I had, because as I got out there, I began to see adults in the neighborhood, in the project that I grew up in, 20, 30 years older than me, and their lives were absolute train wrecks. And it's because I realized when I would talk to them or I'd watch them in the neighborhood, they didn't know the difference. What my mother was telling me at 5 years old, these adults did not know. They didn't know the difference between a reason and an excuse. See, a reason you can work around, a reason you could fix, but an excuse, that's an attitude problem. And you've got to know the difference as an entrepreneur, especially if you're going to be self-employed and especially if you're going to be successful. In the next video, I'm going to give you the next piece of wisdom my mother gave me, which put me on the path for success, because it showed me how to create a plan for anything I wanted to accomplish. We'll see you in the next video. And if you're finding this information helpful, please give us a like. And if you really want to stay plugged into these as we produce this series in the Anyone Can Win Entrepreneurial Training, why don't you subscribe to the America's Blind Tradesman YouTube channel, and you'll be in the know as we develop things. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.